Hello and welcome to this new interview. I'm Alfonso Durán, and today we will cover one of humanity's biggest success stories and one of the largest international public health initiatives in history, polio eradication. Since the launch of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative in 1988, the incidence of polio worldwide has been reduced by 99%, and the world stands today on the threshold of eradicating a human disease globally for only the second time in history after smallpox in 1980. This is a field where medicine and international relations inevitably go hand in hand, and today we will be speaking with one of the experts tasked with this difficult endeavor, Mr. Aidan O Leary, Director for Polio Eradication at the World Health Organization. He joins us online today from WHO headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. O Leary, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us in this event for medical students and international relations students from the European University of Madrid. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Alfonso. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity, and I look forward to a very good and productive discussion over the next hour. At your capable hands.
Great. Mr. O'Leary, as an introduction, as we mentioned, widespread vaccination has helped decrease or virtually eliminate polio from most countries around the world. It has turned into an unknown disease to the newer generations, including myself, a forgotten killer, as many people don't have a sense that it was once one of the most feared childhood diseases. So very briefly, as an introduction, what is polio, how is it transmitted, and what are the medical consequences of a poliovirus infection?
So thanks for the question. So I think firstly, poliomielitis is caused by a human enterovirus called the poliovirus. And it essentially interacts with its host in two ways. One is through an infection, which doesn't include the central nervous system, which causes a minor illness with mild symptoms. The second is an infection which does involve the central nervous system, and this is the infection which potentially may lead and cause paralysis. Less than 1% of all poliovirus infections result in paralysis. The virus is most often spread by the fecal-oral route. The virus enters through the mouth and multiplies in the intestine. And infected individuals normally shed the virus into the environment for a period of several weeks, where it can spread further or quite rapidly through a community, especially in areas where we have very weak sanitation. As I've mentioned, most of the causes will be, or most of this, or the impacts will be minor illness with minor symptoms. But obviously the major one is paralysis, which is lifelong and can't be reversed. And there have also been circumstances where it potentially leads to death. So when we look at what has happened since the launch of the initiative back in 1988, we have estimated that we have perhaps saved up to 20 million children from paralysis and are upwards of 1.5 million children from death as a result of the interventions that have been made during that period. Back to you.
Since the launch of, in the 1950s and the 1960s, we saw the arrival first of the inactivated polio vaccine, and then a few years later, the oral poliovirus vaccine. So continuing with this introduction, what are the main differences between these two vaccines, and which epidemiological context calls for the use of one or another?
So I think these have obviously been the two key tools that are available to the program in terms of addressing or kind of polio and preventing infection. Essentially, the inactivated polio vaccine is administered through our injection, and it invariably supports individual protection by building immunity essentially in the blood. Essentially, what the oral polio drops do is that they don't just protect the individual, but they work to interrupt transmission by building mucosal immunity in the gut. And I think when we look at how this has evolved over periods of time, what you find is that those countries that are still working to address polio outbreaks, they invariably use a combination of mainly OPV, supplemented and supported by IPV. Where you have countries that are essentially polio-free, they have invariably moved to a system where they have introduced IPV into their essential immunization program, and their primary purpose is to maintain high immunity rates overall. And I think that's essentially the difference between the two, in the sense that, IPV is really critical towards maintenance. OPV is really critical towards aggressively working to not just protect the individual, but to interrupt these transmission chains. Back to you.
Dr. O'Leary, recently in April of 2016, following the 2015 eradication of wild poliovirus type 2, a global switch was made from trivalent oral polio vaccine to a bivalent oral polio vaccine, so containing only types 1 and 3 because 2 had been eradicated. So the switch and the delays in including the IPV, as you mentioned, the combined effort, led to a decreased immunity to type 2 poliovirus. So as a consequence, there was outbreaks of circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, and this has become a big public threat that we now have to face. So why is the solution to this problem more vaccination instead of less vaccination, as some people are very confused by this aspect? And what can you tell us about the new oral poliovirus vaccine?
Super. I think it's a really good question, and one that comes up quite a bit. And I think what's important to note with the oral polio vaccines is that there are live elements in the vaccine which, when children shed into the environment, what happens is that these live elements mutate over an extended period of time. And particularly where you have situations where over extended periods of time in communities with very, very low immunity, they can revert to a form that actually causes paralysis. If we look at where the circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses have been most prominent, it is those areas where we have the highest proportions of what we refer to as zero-dose communities and zero-dose children. And these are essentially the children that are either not immunized or under-immunized. So if we look, for instance, at what we speak with at the moment, 90% plus of all the circulating vaccine-derived polio cases in the world in 2022 are concentrated in just 3 geographies. In northern Yemen, in an area that's beset by conflict, our huge economic blockade and acute humanitarian crisis. Eastern DRC, which has a range of the similar factors, and in northern Nigeria, again, where you have significant issues with inaccessibility, insecurity, whether with Boko Haram or organized crime groups. So the key issue for us, as you say, is perversely, the way that you actually protect is through vaccination, because if you're vaccinated, you can't be infected. The fact that these our communities have been so under-immunized for such an extended period of time, this is what actually gives rise to the vulnerability in the first instance. You mentioned very briefly the introduction of the novel oral poliovirus 2 vaccine. This is a vaccine that has been under development for almost a period of 10 years and received WHO's first ever emergency use listing in late 2020. What it seeks to do is, firstly, it is as safe and as effective as the Sabin vaccines that were there beforehand, but it's much more genetically stable, which means that it's much less likely to result in seeding, resulting in future outbreaks going forward. And I think, what's really important for us is that, to work to reduce that seeding, while at the same time continuing to intensify efforts to make sure that the numbers of zero-dose children are significantly reduced. You may have noted from the WUNIC estimates that have been released during the course of the summer of this year, the number of zero-dose children were estimated to rise through the pandemic from a figure of roughly 19 million to more than 25 million in late 2021. So the issue is becoming much more acute. And what the program is really about is making sure that we access these children in the areas where, there are really big challenges, whether inaccessibility and security, whether it's, poor or underperforming or non-existent health systems, or where you have issues of communities being marginalized from the state. And that can be everything from refugees, migrants, or maybe communities that are at odds with the state for a variety of different reasons. So it's a combination of a number of factors that we're working to address.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some figures earlier. Could you give us some idea of the progress that the GPEII has made from 1988 to today in terms of number of cases averted, and also the decline in the number of countries who are endemic with wild poliovirus? So what is the situation now compared as it was at the launch of the initiative?
So when the initiative was launched in 1988, we had almost 1,000 cases per day being recorded across 125 countries. So, that's essentially more than 360,000 children being paralyzed from polio every single year. If we look at the data in 2021, we had just 2 endemic countries, namely Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we had recorded just 6 wild poliovirus cases in 2021, which was the lowest global total ever recorded. In 2022, what we have recorded is an explosive local outbreak concentrated in just 3 of Pakistan's 180 districts, which resulted in the paralysis of 20 children. And we've also had an export of virus from Pakistan, which was detected in Lilongwe in Malawi. And we've subsequently discovered that the locus of that transmission is actually the Zambezi River Basin in northern Mozambique. But where we basically stand now is that we have a total of 30 cases, today in 2022. Again, what we're looking at is numbers, essentially in the handfuls. And I think more importantly, if we look at transmission chains, in a place like Pakistan, we had 11 separate and distinct transmission chains in 2020, just 4 in 2021, and a single transmission chain in 2022. So that single chain has been responsible for every single detection recorded in 2022. And the key issue for us is to knock out, as I say, those chains to basically prevent the cycle of future transmission going forward. So we're kind of as close as I think we've ever been before. And what's really important is we grasp the opportunity to finish the job over the course of the current low transmission season, which has started now and will run until March or April of next year.
Mm-hmm. Well, the numbers are certainly very encouraging. I wanted to ask you also about your title at WHO is Director for Polio Eradication. So what does a pathogenic organism, what characteristics does it have to be able to be eradicated as a disease? And why aim for eradication instead of elimination or control that may be more pragmatic or easier to achieve?
So I think, as you correctly highlighted, not every disease is capable of eradication. I think polio is one of those diseases that are. So the only host for polio is human. So there's no possibility to hide in the animal kingdom or, in the broader environment. We also have essentially the tools that allow us to finish the job. So when we kind of look at the mix and match of a tool that is simple, are efficient to administer, cheap and effective, again, that doesn't necessarily exist with all particular pathogens as well. So we are basically in a situation where, it is only a human host, and we have actually the means to do so. Many other pathogens, that's simply not an option, but for polio, it most certainly is.
Mr. O'Leary, WHO is part of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the GPEI. So in a more international relations questions, which other partners are in the GPEI and what is WHO's role within that partnership?
Super. So I think the first thing with partnerships is a recognition that no one individual organization is capable of doing this on its own. And the partnership that we have is very much in support of member states working through the World Health Assembly and the WHA resolution that was adopted in 1988. The partners that we have bring together a number of capacities and skill sets which are really necessary for us to do the job. So you're correct, we have WHO, and WHO is one of 2 operational partners, and we essentially bring the kind of technical expertise and particularly the campaign operations, to make sure that we're able to deliver campaigns in a timely and quality way. We also bring surveillance expertise, which is really around making sure that we have surveillance systems that are able to detect, identify, and assess the scale and scope of the risk, not just at the country level, but at the regional and global level as well. UNICEF is also a core operational partner. It brings key capacities in the areas of community engagement to make sure that our information to inform community decision-making and build acceptance, confidence, and trust in vaccination and vaccinators is a key area of work that is undertaken. And they also have responsibility for vaccine supply. So, we've kind of touched upon the OPV vaccines, the IPV vaccines. What's really important is that we build a manufacturing base that's able to maintain supply at scale, recognizing that we can be vaccinating upwards of 600, 700, 800 million children a year. We need to make sure we're solid in that regard. We also have the US Center for Disease Control. They bring very specific capacities in the areas of surveillance, particularly on the operation of laboratories and the application of genomic sequencing, which is a key tool which again helps us to better understand the virology of the virus, and again really to help us to make sure we make informed decisions around risk. We also have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is it's a key funding partner, but I think has been a really important addition in terms of their focus in relation to innovation, in relation to analytics, whether it's through operational modeling and so on. Again, what we want to do is to make sure we have high-end or analytics to drive decision making. And they've also played a particularly important role in relation to advocacy. I think for me, a really critical partner has been Rotary International. They play a huge role when it comes to advocacy. So, when we see our polio eradication being raised at the G20, the G7, the heads of Commonwealth and so on, invariably you will find the Rotary International Network through parliaments have played an absolutely major role in making sure that it remains front and center in terms of political will. They're a really important funding partner, and they have also played a critical role in individual countries where they've been able to mobilize their networks to basically make sure that the political will is translated right down to where it counts the most, which is down in communities. Mm-hmm. And then last but not least, we have our Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, who are probably the most recent partner to join. They have been really critical with the introduction of IPV. So that is essentially supported through the Gavi network. And since 2019 alone, that IPV support is the equivalent of $750 million plus, because it's essentially provided without any co-financing by the member states. So what it really is a really key partner in making sure that all the gains that we make through eradication are ultimately going to be sustainable through essential immunization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. O'Leary, you were recently in Berlin for the World Health Summit, where world leaders pledged, I think it was $2.6 billion, American billion, to overcome the final hurdles towards polio eradication with WHO's 2022-2026 strategies. But how do you convince donors to persist in this effort despite the delay in achieving eradication and the relatively low disease burden that polio represents compared with other very pressing public health matters?
So thanks, Alfonso. I think a really good question. So I think firstly on our side, we hugely appreciate all the partners who have pledged at the GPI. I think it's, as you've highlighted, it's not a small ask in these very difficult economic times to mobilize those commitments. And I think not just for the partners who pledged, but also for the other partners in the pipeline, we really appreciate the contributions. So why do countries continue to do this? And I think there's a couple of factors that are behind that. The first is, you touched upon it. It would be only the second human communicable disease ever to be eradicated. It's a huge milestone for humanity to achieve it. And it's not as if we are a long way away, we're extremely close. And I think, as one of our donor friends pointed out, for us to walk away at this point in time, it's like running a marathon and deciding that once you've hit the 26-mile mark, you're not going to run the last 385 yards, you're just going to walk off the pitch. It makes no sense. I think the other fact that is very much there is that it continues to be an informed investment decision, in the sense that when you look at the costs of what it requires to eradicate vis-a-vis the risks and benefits versus the decision not to eradicate, again, what we would find is that we would actually revert back to where that is before. And the real question for us is that, is it acceptable to go back to a situation where tens of thousands or potentially low hundreds of thousands of children would ultimately be impacted adversely by such a decision? So I think the pressure is clearly there to make sure we finish the job. But I think what I have detected from funding partners across the board is a recognition that things are very, very close, but we really do need to finish the job. And I think there is confidence in the strategy that we will be able to do what we're able to do. And I think it's really important that we actually deliver upon that during the course of the upcoming quarters.
Mr. O'Leary, despite the numbers being very, very encouraging, the fact is polio is still declared a public health emergency of international concern according to WHO. Right now, there are only 3 active public health emergencies of international concern. One is polio, the other one is COVID-19, and the most recent one is monkeypox. But why is polio still an emergency, still considered an emergency, despite these low numbers? Is it because of the potential of outbreaks, or the link to this potential exportation to cases to other countries? Why is it still an emergency as such?
So I think when we look at public health emergencies of international concern, I think that the fundamental risk is that as long as you have polio transmission anywhere, potentially everywhere is at risk. And I think we've seen a number of examples in 2022 where, with the importation of wild poliovirus type 1 from Pakistan into Malawi and Mozambique, what it really does underpin more than anything else is that we have to really aggressively address the source of the transmission. And I think it's basically the emergency committee and the IHR provisions are a practical means of really maintaining as much focus as we possibly can to make sure that we deliver upon that. We've also seen during the course of this year that there is sometimes an assumption that this only happens in different parts of the world. In your introduction, you mentioned very clearly that many students of your generation, what is polio? What we saw during the course of the summer is the detections in London, Israel, New York. And again, what it means is that, notwithstanding the fact that, these countries are very low polio, If there are gaps in essential immunization, then the virus will basically, it doesn't respect borders. It will basically target those kind of communities where you have and under-immunized populations. And more than anything else, the importance of maintaining essential immunization rates as high as we can is critical. And again, we've had basically the US, the UK, and Israel with the IHR Emergency Committee during the course of 2022. And the message is the same everywhere. You need to make sure we close the gaps, and we need to maintain robust surveillance systems that allows us to detect transmission in a timely way to inform an aggressive response. So the key issue for us is that we wish to make sure that it retains a very high profile to basically make sure that not just in our countries where we have endemic transmission, but where we also have outbreaks, we are taking in as timely a way as we can the appropriate actions to close those outbreaks as aggressively and as quickly as possible.
Mr. O'Leary, you linking with this risk of exportation to other countries where there are immunization gaps. In the past year, in the past 2 years, it made international headlines when Malawi detected a wild poliovirus case, and then a few months later it appeared in Mozambique. And one of the biggest questions a lot of people raised was, does this affect the WHO African region, Africa's status as wild polio virus free? Does this change it, or what is the new situation with disappearances?
So I think the first thing to note is that we've had a single case reported in Malawi, which is basically detected and reported or notified in February of this year, but the actual case detection was in November. And we've had a further 8 cases reported in Mozambique, the most recent of which was recorded in August of this year. Those cases of wild poliovirus 1 are concentrated in a single province in Tete, along the Zambezi River basin of northern Mozambique. The response that was initiated didn't just concentrate on Malawi from the start. It was Malawi plus each of the neighboring countries of Mozambique, or Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And I think what is really important is that we had a very fast and aggressive response at the outset, and we have seen coverage steadily improve. That said, on the face of it, the country had quite a high essential immunization rate, maybe 80% plus. However, we did detect quite a number of issues in terms of campaign coverage in a number of countries over the course of the past 6 months. Most critically for us, we have recently concluded an outbreak risk assessment. And one of the key findings in that regard is that there has been a significant underestimate of the target child population. So when we basically started, the operating assumption was that we had somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million children under 5 in Mozambique. The latest data suggests that the figure is closer to 8.5 million under 5. So what we have been doing is working to steadily address that. In terms of the certification, have we had situations like this before? The answer is yes. Back in 2010, we had basically the importation of virus from India into the European region and into the Pacific region, with somewhere close to 500 cases over our 4 countries. This time, we're basically talking 2 countries with 9 cases. In terms of what the approach towards certification is, this is a matter that is being reviewed by the Africa Regional Certification Commission, which is taking place a little later this week. And I will be joining them in Johannesburg for that purpose. And then we will have a further deliberation by the Global Certification Commission, probably in January, to review what the epidemiology is basically telling us. And I think what we will are guided by is the epidemiology. But I would simply note that when we look at the scale and scope of what is happening, the African region encompasses almost 50 countries. We're dealing with transmission not in 2 countries, just in very, very narrow subgeographies. And I think there will be a very careful deliberation around what the process is. But I think our primary objective will be to make sure that we actually close the outbreak.
Well, we'll remain vigilant as to your decisions in the following months. I'd like to focus now on the 2 remaining endemic countries that you mentioned. You have extensive experience working both in Pakistan and Afghanistan with UNICEF and with the OCHA. You know the region well, and although they are separate countries with their own separate administrative divisions, why should we consider them only as one sole epidemiological block? And what is the situation with the border crossings between the 2? And why can we not eradicate polio in one country without eradicating in the other?
So thanks again, a really good question. I think we have always treated Afghanistan and Pakistan as a single epidemiological block, for the very simple reason is that the scale of our movement between the countries is such that, the idea that, you can address in one without addressing the other simply doesn't work. I think it is important to note that our Pakistan has a population of between 210 and 220 million. Afghanistan is in the 30 to 35 million range. So, clearly Pakistan is a major driver in this regard. But when we look at the different blocks that are there, it's very, very clear that, while we have very large populations, it's equally clear that the bulk of infected cases tends to be amongst the Pashto populations, which are largely concentrated in the southern half of Afghanistan, but also in the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is immediately bordering Afghanistan on its eastern and southeastern border. So when we kind of look at the 2, the idea that we would draw the line at the border makes no sense. I think the good thing for the program at the moment is that I mentioned a little earlier that we look at transmission chains. So I mentioned in Pakistan, we've gone from 11 chains to 1. In Afghanistan, over a similar period, we've gone from 8 chains to 1. And those chains are confirmed that in 2022 to date, we have no evidence of cross-border transmission. No evidence. So what's really important for us is that we make sure that continues to be the case. The 2 major crossing points, between the 2 countries are in Shannon, Spin Boldak, which is close to Quetta and Kandahar, and also are at the Torkham Gate, which links Peshawar to Jalalabad in the province of Nangarhar in the east. We have vaccination teams on both sides to make sure that all formal movements, children are basically vaccinated. Again, I think the really important point for us is that within each of these countries, so in the case of Pakistan, we're looking at 6 districts out of 180 plus where we have endemic transmission. The major cities, which were the reservoirs of the past, the mega city of Karachi, Peshawar and Khyber, the Quetta block, they are no longer subject to endemic transmission of wild polio virus. Similarly, in Afghanistan, we would have always spoken of Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, as well as the entire eastern region. Now we're just speaking of 2 provinces, Nangarhar and Kunar in the east, that are the only 2 of 34 provinces that are subject to endemic transmission. So what we are really working to do is zero in to clear the last remaining obstacles to make sure we're able to reach and vaccinate all the children that are there.
Continuing with Afghanistan and Pakistan, unfortunately, some of the biggest problems that polio eradication teams face concern both vaccine hesitancy because of the spread of rumors and misinformation, and the issue of security. So how have you lived these two problems on the ground while you were working there?
So I think that the first thing is to take a step back. And I mean, if we look at or maybe Afghanistan first, before the Taliban transition in August of last year, almost 40% of the population was inaccessible to the program for house-to-house vaccination campaigns. So clearly, we had a very difficult time in 2018, 2019, and 2020. One of the first things that was done on our side is that my boss, the Director General, Dr. Tedros, visited Afghanistan in September of last year to talk about the health system in general, but also to talk about the proper resumption of polio campaigns. And, you know, what we have basically seen since then, starting from November, is a full resumption of nationwide campaigns. And, you know, what we've been able to do is to reduce the number of inaccessible children from more than 3.6 million to less than 500,000 as we speak today. And what we continue to do is to work to close those gaps to go forward. And I think we're in a really, really good place in that regard. I think you correctly highlighted the challenges with insecurity. We had a series of tragedies in Pakistan or in Afghanistan in 2020 and most recently, or in 2021 and most recently in 2022, when we had 8 frontline workers killed in Kunduz and Takhar in northeastern Afghanistan, you know, by our kind of insurgents, you know, with basically the polio frontline workers in the middle. We seem to be in a broadly better situation now than we were 6 months ago, but we are acutely conscious of the fact that the humanitarian situation in our Afghanistan is very complex and extremely difficult and getting worse. So for as long as that continues to be the case, we continue to try and make sure we're reaching out to community leaders to make sure we build maximum our acceptance, confidence, and trust that we can. In the case of Pakistan, the issues, I think, are a little different. I think we enjoy pretty broad support. I would say acceptance rates for the vaccine are 95% plus across the board. The places where we have the problems are now very much rooted in southern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, 6 districts, North Waziristan, South Waziristan, Tonk, Banu, Dera Ismail Khan, and a place called Laki Marwat. And these are areas where there's essentially an insurgency involving Tehrik Taliban Pakistan and the state, and in particular the Pakistan Army. So what we have to do is to come up with tactics that are basically continue outreach with communities while working to find ways to make sure that campaign modalities, you know, basically assure the safety and security of our frontline teams on the ground. So for those 6 districts, there's no single or common way of working in terms of how we do our work. It's literally district by district by district. And, you know, while we normally would work towards acceptance, confidence, and trust, ultimately what we're trying to do here is, I think in the backdrop of conflict, that's not an easy thing to do. What we're looking for is acquiescence. And I think, you know, what we've seen is good progress, but the challenge is how do we sustain that going forward? So the issue is not about vaccination per se. The issue is perhaps a community that is marginalized from the state, that's prepared to, you know, to be engaged in conflict. What we want to make sure is that, you know, at least at the very minimum, children are protected from what is the very real risk of polio at this point in time.
And Doctor, thank you for those insightful comments, especially with the the situation in Afghanistan since the regime change in August of 2021. And with regards, with your eyes set to the future and your future work with the polio eradication program, what do you think are the remaining challenges you can tackle, and do you remain optimistic about polio eradication in order to close this interview?
I'm actually, and I know this probably, so firstly, I'm Irish, so yeah. The glass is always half full, but I mean, we're always careful not to drink the Kool-Aid. So what we're basically trying, I mean, the way I would look at it is like this. As we stand in the world today, there are what I would call 7 consequential geographies. If we were to lead or listen to the media reporting over the summer, 90% of the media coverage was about London, US, and Israel. Actually, all of our issues are not in London, Israel, and they're in 7 places. 6 districts of 180 districts in Pakistan, 2 of 34 provinces in Afghanistan. It's 9 states in northern Nigeria. It's south central Somalia in the areas under the control of Al-Shabaab. It is eastern DRC and areas influenced by M23. And it's northern Yemen under the control of the Houthis. And then last but not least, we have northern Mozambique. In every single area, and I repeat, in every single area, we are making significant inroads in closing immunity gaps. And the only place where we're struggling to get the go-ahead for campaigns is northern Yemen. Although at the time of speaking, I understand, there's a breakthrough is imminent, but in the world of polio eradication, we only believe it when we see it. So what I would say is that in November of 2022, those are the areas where ultimately we have to make the difference. And as I say, we're not starting from scratch. We're literally working to close or a small number of remaining gaps in a number of key geographies. So for me, is it feasible? Absolutely yes. The key challenge for us is to stay the course and see it through.
Well, it seems tantalizingly close to to achieve the objectives that were set out so many years ago. But as you mentioned, the situation is extremely complex. Mr. O'Leary, thank you very much. We would like to wish you and all of your team around the world the best of luck in this final mile towards polio eradication. I hope that sooner rather than later we will be able to read headlines in the press that polio has been defeated once and for all. Just like to give the floor back to you just one last time before I stop the recording for any last comments you would like to make for future doctors and future international relations experts towards this field. Thank you.
So firstly, again, hugely appreciate the interest and again, the opportunity to participate, and wish you the very best with the work that you're doing. I guess for me, the final point that I would probably make is, linked to the fact that it is feasible, it's about doing it. And I think particularly after the pandemic, we've had a situation where there has been a lot of doom and gloom about, the role of immunization, the various different challenges that are faced. I think for the world, it's really important that we actually clearly demonstrate through a journey, essentially from 1988, it is actually possible to eradicate a disease, and we do it for only the second time ever. And again, all the issues that are kind of go with that. You've highlighted hesitancy. I would describe that as misinformation, disinformation, and rumors. And the only answer to that has ever been is good information delivered to through the right channels at the front end. And if there's a word that counts, communities matter. Communities matter. And women in particular within communities matter, because they are the key towards our future community health. And as my friends on the health emergency side, is that, you know, the last mile to reach your the households is critical. That last mile is also the first mile in global public health security. And it's really important that in the areas where it's hardest, we do have the very best people. So I do hope maybe at some stage when you work through your courses, we look forward to seeing you on the front lines in the places where your skills, your experience, your capacities are going to be most needed. So on that note, thank you very much again.
Aidan O Leary, Director for Polio Eradication at WHO. Thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Great.
Take care.